Richard Dawkins, the famous skeptic, once wrote that the Judeo-Christian God was arguably the most unpleasant character in all of fiction. A vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. Was Richard Dawkins right? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. Richard Dawkins does assert at the beginning of that very famous quote from his book, The God Delusion, that God is a character in fiction. We've done some sermons and some videos on that. We're not going to touch on whether or not God exists today. Rather, we're going to focus on the back 3/4 of that skeptical word vomit, which is that God is a malevolent and capricious and evil character. This characterization of God is mostly based on his behavior in the Old Testament and a handful of commandments and stories in the New Testament as well, where God seems to sanction things like the genocide of the Canaanites. So we need to ask the question, did God do that? If he did do that, was he justified? And if he didn't do that, then what are we missing in translation? We have a few core assumptions and some vocabulary to get out of the way up front. First of all, our core assumption today, or two core assumptions, is first of all, we're assuming that God does exist, at least for the sake of the argument. And that doesn't mean, like, if you're an atheist or an agnostic watching this, view this video as the way that Christians would reason amongst themselves about these passages. Maybe it'll clear up some issues with your perception of what Christians believe about the Old Testament. So I think it's still helpful even if you don't believe God exists. But that is an assumption that we're going to be carrying with us today. The second assumption is that if God does exist, which we're assuming he does, the highest good that a human can perform is worshiping and obeying God. In Christian belief, God is the highest being in the universe, and the purpose of the rest of creation is to honor and glorify him. We see this in the Old Testament book of Ecclesiastes. If you buy any Christian Bible, you'll find a book within the book called Ecclesiastes, and that's the point of the entire book, is that nothing in life is permanently meaningful except for worship of God. So that's a Christian assumption. We're going to be carrying that with us today because otherwise Christian ethics don't really make any sense. It's a core assumption of Christianity. The last thing, this is an assumption, but just acknowledgement, is that these ideas, normally when I do these things, about 75% of the time, the ideas are either somewhat original to me. I'm sure someone else thought them, but I didn't get them from someone else. Or I got them from a bunch of sources, which is what preachers normally do. We read books about the Bible, and we listen to lectures, and we listen to other sermons, and we steal ideas from everywhere. In this case, though, almost all of the ideas, with a few exceptions, almost all the ideas in here are from one person. His name is Dr. Paul Copan, or I'm not really sure how to pronounce his last name. But he wrote a really famous book back in 2011 called Is God a Moral Monster? So I would definitely recommend picking that up. It's really a better treatise on this issue than what I'm going to be able to give you today. But I'll give you the primer, I'll give you the spark notes today, and then if this interests you, if you want to learn more, go pick up that book as well. Here's some terms that might slip out as we're running through the video today, which, by the way, is going to be a pretty long one. The first one is OT, which means Old Testament, okay? So that's the first chunk, the first 2/3 or so of the Christian Bible. The second one is NT, or New Testament. Again, it's another division of the Bible. It's like the last third of the Protestant Christian Bible. And the last one, and probably the most unfamiliar to most of you guys, is ANE, or Ancient Near East. And this is just a term used to describe the ancient peoples of what is the modern-day Middle East, Northeast Africa, and Asia Minor. So we're talking like Turkey, Israel, Pakistan, Iran, Iraq, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman, like that general area of the world we are broadly going to term the Near East. And then ancient obviously just means like from several millennia ago. So ancient Near East, that's going to be a really important term for us today. Here is one of the texts that we can point to as the origin of this idea that God is like capricious and evil. It's Exodus 23:23. There's other texts that say similar things, though. God is speaking to his people, and he says, "For my angel will go before you and bring you into the land of the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, and I will completely destroy them." After this is said in the following book, or actually several books later in the way that they're ordered in the Old Testament, but chronologically, the next events that happen is the people of Israel, after they receive their law from God, they go into the land known as Canaan, modern-day Palestine, and they make war on the people, and they seemingly slaughter everyone they possibly can, which raises a question for us. Does God command genocide? And even if he doesn't, how is it justified that God is telling his people, his followers, Israel, to wage war on other people, to kill people simply because their religious preferences are different? How do we handle that as modern readers? So there's going to be a couple different ways we're going to answer this today. There's no better way to go than just to get into it. The first thing that we have to assert is that God has the right to judge or demand anything from humankind. We covered this in a lot more detail in the sermon, so again, go back to that sermon last week and watch it if you haven't seen it or if you weren't here with us. If you have seen it and you don't remember anything about it, I don't blame you because Sunday mornings are hard, but go back and watch it again. The SparkNotes version, as we examined a few texts, including Job 38, 1 through 4, Isaiah 61, 8, and I didn't include this one on Sunday, but we can throw it in here now, Deuteronomy 5, 9, and we discovered that God in the Bible is described not just as loving, but also as just or as righteous. He's pictured not only as like a kind father that'll hug you and like pat you on the back and tell you it's okay, he's also pictured as a warrior and as a judge. And most importantly, God in Christian belief created the universe. Christians disagree about like how he did this, like what means and how long and all sorts of stuff like that. And that's not relevant to the argument here anyways. The point is God created everything and he gave you and me everything that we have, including our lives. So he has the right to demand those things from us if he chooses. The biggest emphasis in Christian thought and in Jewish thought even on God's acts of violence are that they're most often acts of punishment or of judgment, that someone has done something wrong and he is judging or punishing that person. And frankly, we should view that as a good thing because we wouldn't want to live in a world where evil was allowed to go unpunished. We object to the idea that God would punish people, that he would order the Israelites to kill people for their sins because, well, it would be wrong for you or I to do this. Like, let's picture it this way in a modern context. We all agree that it's wrong for criminals to commit a crime, and we agree that it's good that when a criminal commits a serious crime that they should be imprisoned. So, like, if someone just walks out on the streets and, like, stabs someone, then they should go to jail for a very long time because they just stabbed someone. You know, like that's generally the assumption we work with. The thing is, if I witness this stabbing, we would generally agree that it is wrong for me as a private individual to go handcuff that person and stick them in my shed and not let them go for 10 years as punishment for their crime. How is that different? How is that different than imprisoning someone? Well, the obvious answer is I'm not the government. I'm a private person. I don't have the right to determine guilt or innocence. I don't have the right to determine proper punishment for an individual. In the same way, God is not a human being. God is, in this illustration, more akin to the government. He is capable of looking at someone. He has the innate right to look at a wrongdoer and determine what punishment, if any, they deserve. So we as individuals can't go out punishing sinners, but God can. And if God chooses to punish someone in this life, then fine. But Christians believe that in the next life, everyone will have to answer for their actions. So even if someone seems to get away in this life, they're not going to get away eternally. They're going to have to answer to God for their actions sooner or later. The first thing we have to understand is God is just. He is a judge, and he will punish people who do wrong, and he will reward people who do right. Often when we see violence in the Old Testament or God behaving in a way that seems unacceptable, there's an element of punishment, of judgment that God is visiting on people who have done wrong. In the case of the Canaanites specifically, we see them practicing horrible moral evils like child sacrifice, like ritual prostitution, things that are not just not acceptable to the Jews, but we would agree today is generally not acceptable. And because of these sorts of practices, God decides to punish them, but we'll get more into that later. The second acknowledgement that we have to make, or the second argument against this idea that God is an evil God, is there are plenty of things that happen in the Old Testament that people act like God was okay with when he clearly was not. One example is David and Bathsheba. The story specifically says the thing that David did was displeasing to the Lord. In other words, God was not okay with it. Another story is Jephthah, who was a judge that if you read the story, and I know there's argument about this if you're familiar with the story, but the plain reading of the story is that Jephthah, the judge, promises, whatever walks out of my house, I will sacrifice, like kill and burn on an altar. I will sacrifice it to God. And then his daughter walks out of his house, and he's like, woe is me. And then he actually sacrifices his daughter. It's horrific. The last story that maybe people will point to, although there's plenty of others, is another story late in Judges about an unnamed Levite and his unnamed concubine. It's a really dreadful story that honestly I don't even want to summarize here because YouTube might take my video down, so I won't. But if you are a discerning adult, then go read that, but massive trigger warning here because the story is absolutely disgusting. But in all of these cases, the main characters in the story, David, Jephthah, and this unnamed Levite, break numerous laws written out in the Old Testament. So people will read these stories and they'll go, oh, well, God must be okay with this because it's in the Old Testament. And frankly, that is just a poor reading of the Old Testament. If you want a list of laws that these guys violated in various ways, here's 3 of them. Deuteronomy 22:23 through 27, Exodus 20:13, and Leviticus 22 through 5. Moreover, every single one of these laws places a responsibility on those around the lawbreaker to punish them when they break this specific rule. And in all of these cases, the person was not punished by those around them. I'll give a pass to the people around David because he was king and, it's kind of hard to oppose a monarch. But at least in the cases of Jephthah and the Levite, they should have been punished by their peers, and they weren't. That doesn't mean that God was okay with what happened. It just means the people weren't following God's law. The Old Testament actually has quite a few stories in it that are not meant to be examples, positive examples. Like the Old Testament would go, hey, go be like Jephthah, go sacrifice your children. They're actually meant to be negative examples. They're meant to be examples of the horrible things that people will do when they separate themselves from the way that God wanted them to live, when they refuse to allow God a place in their life, when they won't follow God's rules. So, not everything in the Old Testament is sanctioned by God. There's plenty of things that are bad that are recorded by the Old Testament, but God does not approve of them. And if you read his laws in Leviticus and Deuteronomy and Numbers, you'll understand he does not sanction these sorts of activities.